Hi folks, welcome back. Alex Wiseman here talking about globalization and contextualization. And we just got through looking at some interesting comments from our course discussion board and a brief description of some of the foundation that David Baker was laying for us in his book, The Schooled Society. And so we thought we would take a look at that and sort of move on and see if we could find any more critical perspectives that we could bring to that, rather than just maybe sticking with the line that David Baker is providing us. Well, one way to sort of ease us around this a little bit is to look at this comment from Drory, Jang, and Meyer from 2006 that talks about the effects of globalization, which are the dual process of a global consolidation of a field and of a shared script, that's one, as well as the penetration of that globalized script into a growing number of countries, that's two. So the idea that there's this dual process of a shared script and then the penetration of that script into different countries. But what is the script, you might ask? Well, that's interesting for us to consider because there are different ways that we can talk about the script. Fran Vavris, who's currently a professor at the University of Minnesota, wrote an article, or actually she wrote a chapter several years ago in a book on policy barring, where she said, up to now the process of externalization has been considered primarily from an international perspective that looks at how educational models and policy language in one state are appropriated by another. But an equally compelling approach to the study of borrowing and lending explores how the language of policy in education and in other sectors is externalized without reference to a specific lending country or agency. So she's arguing that the intensification of global networks in recent years has contributed to the universalization English please, universalization of keywords. Man, whew, I did it. So we have this contrast between externalization and universalization as a way to think about this shared script and how it penetrates different countries or different educational systems. And the externalization process is the way of thinking about one's own community or institutions or processes or functions in relation to or as influenced by those models or languages or policies in another state that are appropriated for your own. And that what she's suggesting is that as that has intensified and as global networks have grown, there has been a universalization of the discourse around education in particular as a result of this externalization process of globalization. Now, what does that look like? Well, it looks like having universalized scripts, which basically means shared expectations and values regarding what education is and how it should be structured or studied. So when you have these universalized scripts, it constructs education in a rationalized way that is meant to enhance capacity, diversity, efficiency, etc., all within the boundaries of these shared expectations and values. Now, what's rationalized about this is that it appears to be logical, but it does not always have a logical fit with the outcomes. So the process or the script can be decoupled completely or loosely coupled to some degree with the outcomes, with what actually happens. So the policy, for example, may be gender equality in the classroom. However, the reality might very well be that there is gender segregation between boys and girls. This is an example of how the universalized script, the shared expectations and values for gender equality, for example, can be rationalized but not necessarily implemented in the real world because there is no structure or support or resources to make that happen. Well, one of the ways we get these universalized scripts, in spite of the fact that they don't often or don't always lead to the logical or the rational outcomes, is through three major transformations that are related to the categorization and differentiation of education knowledge worldwide. Those are the internationalization of educational governance, the expansion of higher education, and the rise of what we call a knowledge society or a knowledge economy. These are three ways that education has been institutionalized or globalized, and ways that that has been done through these shared expectations and values, these universalized scripts, ways that it has been done by the process of externalization, which leads to this universalization. Now, the internationalization of educational governance takes place on a couple of different planes, but one way to think about it is this universalized discourse, these universalized, as Fran Vavris said, keywords, right? So we have discourse increasingly framed by international or global terms like human rights, like democracy, like equality, like all sorts of other things that we can think of. And that this discourse is intensified by the availability of international data on education. That comes from some of the typical sources: the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, the Program for International Student Assessment, the Teaching and Learning International Study, the Teacher Education Development Study. I mean, the list can go on and on of internationally available data, or we could just look to UNESCO or the World Bank or any other organization that makes their data or their statistical information publicly available online. When we have intensified availability of international data on education, we have the tendency to compare, and when we compare, we tend to use a discourse that is framed by these international or global terms. So in a way, comparative education and comparative processes are contributing to the internationalization of educational governance. We also have this idea that extensive borrowing or copying across countries occurs, and that it is certainly a complex process, but that there is this exchange of information back and forth, I guess up and down, that occurs, and it's often on a best practice model. What is best practice in Singapore is often brought to the United States or to Germany or to the United Arab Emirates or somewhere else. And then finally we have this idea that we are creating an intellectual space. We're creating a knowledge space that didn't necessarily exist before. In other words, in previous eras, any sort of intellectual pursuit or knowledge may have been attached to the technical or the vocational or the occupational or the nitty-gritty outcome or purpose of that knowledge or skill. But what we have with the internationalization of educational governance is the creation of education itself as its own space. And in that own space lives certain types of information or knowledge, expert knowledge or expert information about what education is, how it's done, etc. So that was the first of many, three in particular, major transformation related to the categorization and differentiation of education knowledge worldwide. Another one is the expansion of higher education. Evan Schofer and John Meyer back in 2005 argued that a new model of society became institutionalized in the post-World War II period. That was reflected in trends toward increasing democratization, human rights, scientization, and development planning, and that this global institutional and cultural change paved the way for hyper-expansion of higher education. Now, David Baker talks a lot about higher education because higher education is where this scientization or this creation of expert or professional knowledge tends to be institutionalized. Not that expert or professional knowledge didn't exist before. It is simply categorized, codified, and then embedded within higher education systems. And as higher education systems expanded throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, the expansion or the embeddedness of expert and professional knowledge, the scientization phenomena, occurred at a faster and faster or a greater and more permanent way. So that gives us one of the again, three major transformations related to the categorization and differentiation of education knowledge worldwide. Finally, we have the very straightforward approach that there is now a knowledge society and economy, and as we said here, the rise of the knowledge society and economy. So the way that this happens is that the exchange of knowledge becomes a basic industry of society. It becomes a key way that we think about exchanging goods and services. Goods and services now can be defined as knowledge or information or data, and that there are certain kinds of knowledge then that have more or less value, or are more or less useful, or are more or less unique and rare. We also see that there is change or development based on intergovernmental organizations' agendas as much or equal to nation states. In other words, as IGOs, and we talked about intergovernmental organizations last time, intergovernmental organizations would be things like the United Nations, the World Bank, etc., 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 right? As these intergovernmental organizations, other organizations where many governments, many states participate, create their own agendas, they are actually creating which knowledge is part of the legitimized discourse. It is often going to be knowledge related to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and economy, and knowledge related to the economy and economic functions. That is interesting in light of what we're going to talk about a little bit for next week, but I won't get to that yet. All right, so we have these are the three major transformation ways that education, information, or knowledge is categorized and differentiated, which is all part of our larger goal of understanding how universalized scripts, shared expectations and values, externalization processes, and the global diffusion and adaptation of knowledge contributes to our understanding of globalization and contextualization. I'm going to skip all the way back to where I was. So what impact does this have on education? Well, one, when we have a developed knowledge society, it shapes education as a couple of things. One, research-oriented. Two, evidence-based. And three, in a laboratory type of environment. In other words, it mixes the empirical with the rational. Sorry for my handwriting. This means that all sorts of information tends to be research-oriented, meaning that the scientific method has been followed. The scientific method is basically an empirical method that sets up a hypothesis. You test the hypothesis with data, and then you make some sort of statement about what knowledge is based on whether or not the data upheld your hypotheses. It's evidence-based. In other words, it is now empirical. It is based on observations or data or things that can be measured rather than generated through ideology or philosophy or ideas. Not that ideology wouldn't be embedded behind this, but the idea of what actually a knowledge society is and how it shapes education has become, has fallen in love, shall we say, with the idea of an evidence base. And then finally we have this emphasis on a laboratory environment where we have this testing of hypotheses with empirical or evidence-based data, and it follows a very rational process, right? Or it's rationalized, because we've already talked about the fact that there is not always a direct relationship between what happens in education or the knowledge society and what happens in the labor market or the real society. So testing and empirical results become expert knowledge bases for education as a science, social science, but admittedly it's still a science, and as a profession. That is the impact on education that the knowledge society and the globalization of information and knowledge has had on education. Now, how can we trace the construction of the knowledge base? Well, one, we can look at how legitimacy and the transmission of expert knowledge has happened over time. And this has happened through the development of education as a technical science. That would involve that scientific rational inquiry we just talked about. That would involve a shift from an emphasis on equity or access to a shift on accountability or performance. And that would occur as a result of the ever-expanding educational attainment from primary and secondary all the way through higher education. And this would be our friend Ronald Dorr making an appearance. Excuse me. We're going to pause here, and we will come back in our next screencast to talk about global governance.